Good evening and welcome to this Oundle Festival of Literature event. My name is Helen and I'm the Festival Director. At our festival we have events throughout the year and you can sign up to receive our newsletter and find out what events are coming up on our website at oundlelitfest.org.uk. Just before we start, for those of you who have perhaps not been on a webinar before, can I bring your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen? Please use this to ask your questions. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the event and we'll take your questions then. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome to our festival Iain Dale.
Hello.
Welcome, Iain. I'd just
like
to
press the button in time.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to highlight some achievements in Iain's amazing career, as he has done a great many things. Iain Dale is an award-winning broadcaster and presenter of the evening show on LBC Radio. He was named Radio Presenter of the Year in 2013 and 2016 at the Akiva Awards and was shortlisted for Speech Programme of the Year at the 2013 Sony Radio Awards. In 2014, he won a Sony Award for the Best Interview of the Year. He is the author-editor of more than 40 books and the former managing director of Britain's leading political publisher, Backbite Publishing. He formed the company in 2009 and has published more than 600 books. Iain is one of Britain's leading political commentators and bloggers. He is the host of the For the Many podcast with former Home Secretary Jackie Smith and the Iain Dale All Talk podcast, and also has a podcast of his weekly cross-question political panel show. He is a regular pundit on Newsnight, The Andrew Marr Show, Jeremy Vine, and Good Morning Britain. Welcome, Iain.
Thank you very much.
This book, Why Can't We Just All Get Along? Shout Less and Listen More, is written in a very heartfelt and sincere way. It was published in the summer of 2020. Why did you feel that this was the right time to put down your words?
Well, it turned out not to be the right time, given that all the bookshops were closed. So that was a bit of a mistake in terms of timing. It was supposed to come out in April, but literally a month after the pandemic started. And then the publishers thought, well, it'll all be over by August, so let's put it out in August. And of course it wasn't. But the reason I wanted to write this book was, well, there were multiple reasons, but I was inspired, first of all, by the Queen, believe it or not, because in 2018, in her Christmas message, she essentially said, why can't we all just get along? If you remember back at that point, this was at the height of all of the Brexit rows. And families were being sort of ripped apart by Brexit. Friendships were ending over Brexit. And I must admit, it was the first time in my adult life when I'd really experienced this kind of vituperation that there was in our public discourse. It was a bit in the 1980s when I first came of age politically, I suppose. You had all the nuclear disarmament debate, and that could get a bit feisty on both sides from time to time. But this was something different, something that I'd never really experienced before. And I remember the day after the referendum result, my sister rang me and said, "You've ruined my daughter's life," because I'd voted Leave, she had voted Remain. And she was genuinely really angry about it. And I thought, for goodness sake, I mean, in fact, I should say to her now, do you think your daughter's life has been ruined? She's actually attending a drama school in Paris. I mean, wow. What's changed? But I was very worried about the way that our public discourse was going at that point. And just before Christmas, the Mail on Sunday rang me up and they said, look, this is what the Queen's going to say. We'd like you to write a feature article for our Boxing Day edition, or was it New Year's? I can't remember anyway, about the state of public discourse. So I wrote 1,500 words, which is quite a lot for a newspaper column, particularly at Christmas, as if I didn't have anything better to do. And this article seemed to really catch a wave. And there was a lot of reaction to it. I suppose there's no other news around at the time, but it did start a bit of a debate about why our public discourse has become so coarse, why people on social media will say things to each other that they would never say if they met the person face to face. So that was quite an interesting experience. And then a few months later, I was reading Emily Maitlis's book, Airhead, which it's not an autobiography, but it's a series of incidents in her broadcasting career that are actually either funny, insightful, or whatever. And I thought this is a brilliant book. And then I thought, this is the book I'd like to write. because my literary agent had kept on at me to think of a book that I wanted, that I should write, and there was nothing that came to mind where I felt sufficiently passionately to do it. So I rang him up and I said that I want to do my version of Emily Maitlis. And he said, well, it's funny you should ring, because HarperCollins have just been on the phone. They want you to write a book for them. And I said, oh, what on? And they said, well, they want you to write a response to James O'Brien's book. And for those of you who don't know, James O'Brien is a colleague of mine on LBC, but shall we say we're on opposite sides of the political fence. And he'd written a best-selling book called How to Be Right. And I said, well, if I'm going to write a book, it's going to be my book. I'm not doing it in response to anyone else. Anyway, we had a meeting, and I was telling them about this Mail on Sunday article and my idea for the book. And they said, well, why don't we try and put the two together? So what essentially I've done is tried to, and I hope not too awkwardly, put those two ideas together. So there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in this book, sort of from my career, my life, my views, but all in with the theme of public discourse. And of course, being on the radio, doing all these television programs, that feeds into it. I was Britain's first, or certainly one of the first 3 political bloggers. That was really, I suppose, how I kind of made my name in the early part of the century. And so I started writing, and I've edited a lot of books in the past, but I've never actually written one of this length. And I found that I actually rather enjoyed it. I've never really enjoyed writing, if I'm honest. I always think if I write a newspaper column, the moment I send it off to the newspaper, they'll send it back and say, this is rubbish, start again. Now, they never have, but I still think that. Even I've got to write the New Statesman diary this weekend, and I know as soon as I press that button, that feeling of slight imposter syndrome is going to come back, because I've never really thought I was a very good writer, which I suppose I shouldn't be saying to people in the hope that they buy my book.
I mean, you said in the prologue, which you added while you were waiting for the book to be published, I understand, that the coronavirus crisis actually deepened the discontent between the media and the general public. What evidence do you have for that? Why do you feel that's the case?
Well, I think it's actually got even worse as it's gone on, because you have a growing number of people who just want to question every decision the government makes and every decision that the health authorities make. You've got the classic thing this week on mandatory vaccinations, where you've got a real split, where I take the point of view that if I go into hospital, I don't want to be cared for by somebody who hasn't been vaccinated. I'm sorry, I just don't. And why in the NHS or in a social care setting you would even think of not being vaccinated and putting the people that you're supposed to be caring for at risk, I do not know. Now, that obviously is a fairly trenchant position. And yet, on the other side of the coin, you've got people who say, well, it's an assault on our civil liberties. Everyone has a right to decide whether they should be vaccinated. Well, of course they do. No one's saying that somebody's going to actually forcibly jab you. You still have a choice as to whether you're going to be jabbed. There's a consequence. If you don't get the jab, you can't work in that setting anymore. And that has set people against each other. And there are lots of other decisions that have had to be made over the past 18 months where, I mean, you've got the anti-vax lobby, who I regard as a load of delusional nutters, dangerous nutters. And then you've got people who are concerned about civil liberties. Now, I can respect those concerns. I would say that I'm a civil libertarian myself. But there are times when governments have to intervene. And I mean, the whole face mask debate about whether they were effective or not. Again, you've got people on one side or the other. No, there's nothing wrong with that. Public debate thrives on that sort of thing. But it's the way we debate. That's the problem, particularly on social media.
Yes. I mean, you had to announce that Boris Johnson had been taken into intensive care, and people reacted in a very sort of unpleasant way. Do you think that would have happened 10 or 20 years ago?
Some people did. I mean, there were lots of people that didn't. I mean, I was on air that night, and I had people ringing in, die-hard Labour supporters, who were genuinely upset at the fact that he'd been taken to hospital. I mean, it's a big thing when the Prime Minister of the country, in theory, could have died, and by all accounts, he very nearly did. Now, I think you don't have to be a diehard Conservative supporter to be worried about the fact that your Prime Minister. I mean, think about if he had died. I mean, that really would have sent out the message that I guess that everyone needed to obey the rules that were being imposed on us all. And that was an interesting experience, because yes, you did get some people on Twitter who said some very nasty things, but generally I think that was an occasion where people did manage to control themselves in a way that maybe sometimes they hadn't before. And that's really there's no great secret to improving public discourse, but one of the ways that we can do is to just hesitate a little before we press send on something that could be construed as hurtful or I'm just going to say insightful. I don't mean it in the I mean to something that might incite people to do things that they might otherwise not do. It's a sort of count to 10 syndrome, isn't it? And it's very understandable. If somebody insults you on social media, your natural human reaction is to think, well, how dare they do that? And then you type something out that's possibly even a little bit more aggressive than what they've sent to you, and before you know, you've got it escalates, and you've each made an enemy of each other. But it doesn't have to be like that. I'll give you one example. About nearly a year ago now, I was on the radio, I don't know what we were talking about, and somebody tweeted, Iain Dale is so far up Boris Johnson's arse you can't see his shoes. And a few years ago, I might well have reacted quite angrily to that. But I just said in response, this is not true. Here are 9 occasions in the last 2 weeks where I have criticised either Boris Johnson or the government. And the next day, this guy direct messaged me and he said, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I realise it's wrong, blah, blah, blah. So I accepted his apology. And then we developed this slightly weird online friendship. And I got to know about his life. He got to know more about me. We then went on to WhatsApp. And to this day, we sort of text each other, maybe not every single day, but we've actually become friends. And up until about 3 months ago, I'd never met him. And he said, I see you speaking at Buxton Literary Festival. I'll come and be in the audience. So I said, well, that'd be nice to actually put a face to the name. Yeah. And the day before I was due to speak, the guy who was supposed to do your job and interview me on stage at the festival got COVID. So the organisers were in a right old panic, and the lady who was organising it, Vicky, she said, "Oh, I suppose I'll have to do it," and clearly not relishing the job. So I said, "Well, okay, why don't we get this guy Richard to do it? I've never met him, but I've helped him set up a mental health podcast, and he has interviewed me on that podcast, so I know he knows how to interview." So we met literally half an hour before we went on stage. Wow. And he did a brilliant job.
Yes.
Now that is where I've made a new friend. He's made a new friend, but we could have been mortal enemies.
Yes. Yeah. That's a really good story. Okay, so the first section of your book concentrates on the media, and it made me pause for a moment when you made the point that people under 35 years of age have no recollection of the time without the internet, and technology has changed so much when we think about it. Do you feel that it's a change for the better?
I think generally, yes. I can remember, I think in about 1994, I said to a colleague of mine at work, I said, "Dave, what's this thing called email? Should we have it?" And up until that point, it was all faxes and phone calls. There was nothing else. And people look at you slightly weirdly now if they're sort of in their teens or 20s and think, well, how did life exist? Yes. I did my university dissertation on 10,000 words in German on a German typewriter. If I made a mistake, I had to start the page again. I mean, that's just how things were. Yes. I mean, I was at the very beginning of computerization. I did a module on teaching English as a foreign language, and we had to learn BBC Basic, and it really was basic, but I just wasn't attuned to it. And in the end, I said to my course tutor, "Can I write an extra essay rather than do this, because I just don't understand it," which is odd. In later years, I became a bit of a sort of internet innovator with political blogging and a few other things. But I've never been very technologically literate. But I think generally it has been a force for good. It has been a force for democratization.
Yeah.
Where if you think in 1995, Mrs. Miggins at 32 Acacia Avenue would have no opportunity to make her views known on anything unless she wrote a letter to her local newspaper. She might get on a local radio phone-in from time to time, but that was the extent of her ability to make her views known. Then along came websites. So you could have a website, but unless you were technically gifted, they were quite difficult to update. You had to get somebody to do it. And then came blogs, which were relatively instantaneous. If you wanted to write 20 words, 100 words, 1,000 words, you could publish it on your own blog free of charge, and you would get an audience. And as soon as I remember going to Washington, D.C. in about, I think, 2002, and this guy showed me his blog. I'd never heard the word before, but I instantly got what it could do. So he set one up for me in 10 minutes, and off I went. And of course, in about 2007, 2008, along came Twitter, which usurped blogs in many ways because it was even more instantaneous. You just typed it and off it went, and you could have conversations. So Mrs. Miggins was in her element if she had something to say. So you had the phenomenon of citizen journalism starting, where people who weren't qualified journalists could break stories themselves. And again, that was a great thing to happen. But gradually, the mainstream media took over blogging. And a lot of mainstream media journalists didn't really get Twitter when it started, but eventually did. And you can't be a journalist now without being on Twitter. I have to say, if I didn't have to be on Twitter for what I do, I may not be on it now because of the sewer that it's actually become. And the problem with a lot of social media, this is the downside, is that it allows a lot of anonymous people, a lot of evil people to have a voice. So it's great for the Mrs. Migginses of this world to have a voice, but it also means that some very evil people have a voice. And I must admit, I didn't realize how many evil people there were in the world until I've been on social media. Just people who are just plain nasty. And they obviously get a kick out of it. Otherwise, why would they do it?
Yes.
And that's where we've got to in our public discourse. But on the other hand, you could say, well, it's always been this way. You look at the Hogarth cartoons of the 18th, 19th century. You look at the scenes in the House of Commons, and they're far more violent, and the rhetoric is far more violent than anything that people indulge in public life nowadays. So there's always been this robustness about our language in this country and the kind of debates that we have. But somehow the internet has brought out the worst in people.
Yeah. Why do you think that some people believe and feel that they can use social media in a way to interact with people that they don't know, that they wouldn't even dream of doing it in actual real life? Why do they think they can get away with it?
Because they can. There are no restrictions placed, or very few restrictions placed by the social media companies who pretend that they're platforms, whereas actually they're publishers. And I think that's going to be a big debate now. We have the online harms bill going through Parliament, which I think will try and restrict anonymity on the internet. It's very difficult for legislators to regulate the internet because you really have to have all the countries in the world doing it at the same time. If Britain does something and no other country does, well, people will just base themselves elsewhere. Yeah. So it's, and generally in technological areas, politicians are 10, 15 years behind the technology. That's always been the case. Now, I think there are ways to deal with anonymity because there are some people who legitimately can't say who they are on the internet. For example, a civil servant. You can't be on Twitter and give your real name as a civil servant, but there are ways around that. And at the moment, you don't have people don't have to give their real names. Well, okay, you can still operate under a pseudonym, but we have these messages now that banks do, where if you're going to validate your account, they send you a 6-figure code. Well, therefore, that means that they have your email and mobile phone number. Well, that isn't done by all of the technology companies at the moment. So there are things that can be done, but they're very reluctant to do it because they would have to employ an awful lot more people to police it. Yes. There have been several occasions when I've reported things on Twitter to Twitter saying, look, this is not acceptable. and they just come back and say, well, it doesn't break our rules. And you think, well, what rules are there? If it doesn't break your rules, the rules need to be changed.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it's a valid argument if people say, well, everybody's entitled to freedom of speech? Or do you think, that can't be used to sort of cover actually, insightful and
I would be
horrible
the
emails?
first to defend freedom of speech, but we don't have absolute freedom of speech.
Mm.
We never have done, and in a way never should do. There's the famous thing about crying fire in a cinema. Should people be allowed to do that under freedom of speech? Well, of course they shouldn't. And we have hate crime laws in this country, some of which people may think have gone a bit too far, and our freedom to say a lot of things has been influenced by this so-called woke agenda, where you say one word out of line in the trans debate, for example, and you will be cancelled. And I mean, there's all sorts of strands to this which have no sense of nuance whatsoever. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was on Good Morning Britain this morning, and Kate Garraway's phone went off twice.
Yeah.
And Ben Shepherd found this incredibly funny. And and Kate didn't think it was her phone. He said, it is your phone, you're sitting on it. So I just sort of said, on the spur of the moment, well, you obviously like the vibrations, Kate. Now, somebody on Twitter then said, that was such a misogynistic thing to say, you should be ashamed of yourself. Thinking, for goodness sake, did you get out of bed the wrong side? Lighten up. It was a little joke. And if I had been misogynistic, I'm sure Jackie Smith would have pulled me up on it. But I recognise, as a 59-year-old white male, there are things that if I say now that I would have routinely maybe said 20 years ago, they're not acceptable in today's society. So language, part of my degree was linguistics, so I understand that language evolves all the time, and I make no great complaint about that. But I do complain when people are cancelled because they have expressed a view which, just because people think it's politically incorrect, that they shouldn't be allowed to say it. I mean, I'd hate to be a comedian nowadays.
Yes.
I'm not saying that I found any of the sort of racist comedians very funny sort of in the 70s and 80s. But I was listening to a podcast with Jeff Norcott, who's a sort of right of centre comedian, yesterday, and he had another comedian on called Adam Rowe, who's on the left, and they had a really interesting discussion about what they can say and what they can't say, and what happens if they suddenly go over the line. And it's a very, very difficult place now, Britain. In publishing, it's the same. When you have staff at J.K. Rowling's publishers say, we don't want to work with her, we don't think we should be publishing her books, just because she has what I would consider to be a very mainstream view on trans issues, where women's rights should be defended, she's effectively being cancelled by people in her publishing company. And this happens all the time. That was what gave me great pleasure from publishing, in that I would publish a lot of these books that other publishers wimped out of publishing.
I mean, in that example, I can't see why her views on that topic should have anything to do with her books.
No, and that's because you think along the same lines as 99% of the British public. Yeah. But there's 1% who will use any opportunity to cancel somebody. I mean, people have tried to cancel me over the years because I don't always, I mean, on the one hand, I'm accused on Twitter of being a woke lefty, and on the other hand, I'm accused of being a right-wing fascist. Well, I mean, there are shades of grey in between those two positions, and people who use the word fascist as an insult generally haven't got a clue what it means.
I mean, on television and radio, you find that they like to put opposites up against one another. And in many cases, it's just to create an argument so that they can have a headline the next day. Can you tell us about your different experiences on appearing on Question Time, for example? How did you find that programme?
Well, I've appeared on it twice, but I doubt whether I'll ever appear on it again. For the simple reason that on the second occasion, the experience was so awful that I wrote a piece for the Telegraph on what had happened. And it was in September 2018, and it was at the height of the Brexit rows. And it was the first programme back in September. And for some reason, they decided to have 6 panellists, not 5. And if you think about it, it's an hour-long programme. So divide an hour by 6, then include Fiona Bruce's time, then include the audience time, and you can see how little time you're going to get. And it was a really bad decision to do that, which I think they have acknowledged in the end. The first time I went on, it was in Chesterfield. I was on a nice panel with Vince Cable, Liz Truss, Emily Thornberry, and Nesreen Malik from The Guardian. That she had never appeared on it before either. And David Dimbleby was presenting, and he made it a really pleasurable experience. The audience was a good audience. It wasn't a bear-baiting audience, and everyone had their say. And it was, I mean, I was very nervous about it because it's a tremendous opportunity to make a complete arse of yourself. And there's always that thought that, oh my God, what if there's a question that I don't know the answer to, or I haven't got anything to say on? But then you have to think, well, I speak for 3 hours on the radio every night. I ought to be able to say something at least that's moderately intelligent. Anyway, it went well. So they then had me back about a year later in this panel of 6. And again, it was Emily Thornberry, Ian Blackford from the SNP, Richard Tice from the Brexit Party, Kwasi Kwarteng from the Conservatives, and Layla Moran from the Liberal Democrats. And it was a complete bun fight. And Layla Moran and I mean, we didn't discuss it, obviously, because we're at opposite sides of the table, but we just sat there and let the others go at it, because I was just thinking, what on earth are people thinking at home? And I thought, if I get involved in this, it's not going to be to anyone's advantage. So I didn't until I was spoken to. And then an audience member said something which he'd got a fact wrong. And I sort of intervened and said, well, that's not quite the case. This is the case. And then Fiona Bruce turned around and said, this is not the Iain Dale show. And I thought, well, I've hardly spoken up to now. And then there was a question which she didn't actually bring me in. And I said, don't I get a go on this one? So I did. And then Ian Blackford interrupted me after 9 seconds. Then he interrupted me again after another 10 seconds or so. And I sort of rolled my eyes, and you could tell the audience were getting a bit annoyed with this. And then the third time he did it, I nearly walked out, which would have been a big thing to do. But I was just so frustrated. And I just sort of threw up my hands. And I said, look, is this the way that we're going to debate here? Because it's not a debate. If you don't let me get more than 10 seconds out, how can I actually develop the point that I'm trying to make? Cue massive cheers in the audience.
Yeah.
But it was just a horrible, horrible experience. Yeah. And I know if you ever write an article about saying you've had a horrible experience on a program, you know you do it with the expectation of never being invited back. And that was two years ago, and I haven't been. But I don't really care.
You say in the book as well, interviews have tended to become shorter, often less than 15 minutes, as people are thought to have shorter attention spans. I actually find that quite insulting, that some, I don't know, TV producers decided that we haven't got long attention spans. Do you think interviews should be longer?
Well, it depends. If you are hosting, excuse me, if you are hosting a breakfast or a drive time show, they have to be quite fast paced, because the average length of time that someone listens to those shows is 20 minutes. And people want to know the news in 20 minutes. I mean, LBC has launched 2 years ago, launched a new sort of sister station called LBC News, and you get the news, travel, weather, sport, all in 20 minutes, every 20 minutes. So they don't expect people to listen for hours on end. Now, my program in the evening is a bit different. I have a lot more latitude because it doesn't have to be a fast-paced news program. We do a news program at an hour at 7, where we will do shortish interviews because you want to cover the news of the day. People are driving home at that point, or they're cooking the dinner and they want to catch up on the news. Well, it's the only place you can do on the radio at that point. But then I can do hour-long interviews if I want on the program. Very few people ever get the opportunity to do that, because what you've got the presenter in front of the microphone, you've got the program editor who's very keen to get a news line from the program so they can sort of spin it out into the rest of the media and get coverage. You've got the producer who's in your ear trying to, well, if the politician doesn't give you an answer, they're saying, right, go at it again, go at it again. And if you're doing a 4 or 5 minute interview, and you go into it with pre-prepared questions, and the politician goes into the interview wanting to get 1 or 2 points over, no matter what you ask the politician, well, who's the loser in all of that? The listener.
Yes.
And if the interviewer is just aggressive from the off, well, politicians, believe it or not, are human beings too. And if I'm aggressive to you in this interview, you're going to recoil and put the shutters up, and you're going to think, oh, he's not very nice. And then you will become a little bit stilted, and we won't have any kind of dialogue at all. And it's basic human nature. And I've often found that in a half-hour interview, the newsline comes at minute 28, because by then they've got rid of all of the sound bites that they come out with. And if you let a politician talk, generally they might say something of interest.
Yeah. That's
not to say that you're going to let them off the hook. And if you're not being aggressive or rude to a politician, people nowadays think that's a soft interview. So I know I've got a reputation as being a soft interviewer, because I prefer to have a conversation. I think you get far more out of people in that format. And the podcast that you mentioned that I do, Iain Dale All Talk, where I have somebody with me for an hour, and we talk about their lives, their motivations, their careers. I did one with Barry Gardner, the Labour MP, this week, who people might not think of him and me as being natural soulmates, but I think it was one of the best interviews I've done. It was a real conversation. I remember asking him a question towards the end: what do you think you've got wrong in your life? And there was quite an awkward silence after that, because I don't think anybody had ever asked him that before.
Tricky question.
And it is a tricky question. I never prepare questions. I was doing the media show on Radio 4 once about the art of political interviewing. And Amal Rajan, and I was on with Andrew Marr and Rachel Sylvester from the Times. And if I'm honest, I was quite pleased to be invited in that kind of company. And Amal Rajan started by asking me, well, how do you prepare for a big interview like with the Prime Minister? And I remember thinking, God, shall I tell the truth or not? So I said, I don't.
You see, I think that's very brave.
Well, and Andrew Marr's jaw was on the floor at that point, because what he does is to wargame an interview. So he'll get his producer to play the role of the Prime Minister. So he'll ask a question, and depending what they think the politician's answer will be, they then go on to a different question. Or if it's a different answer, they go on to question C. I can't do that. My brain would be mush. It's different for everybody. I mean, that works for Andrew. It doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
And yes, it is flying by the seat of your pants sometimes. So I sometimes have 5 bullet points where there's sort of 5 different areas I want to cover. Because obviously, if you're interviewing the Prime Minister, you know you've only got a certain amount of time. So you've got to be, it can't be a free-flowing conversation. There's got to be a certain amount of planning in terms of topics. But you then see where the conversation goes.
Yes.
And I think that gets far more results than this sort of "why are you lying to me" type attitude that some interviewers have, where it seems to be all about them and their ability to ask a rude question. And we saw that during COVID at those awful press conferences, where you had all of the big name journalists strutting their funky stuff and trying to basically trip up the politicians. And it was the regional journalists who always asked the questions that the public wanted to know the answers to. And I thought that was very illustrative of the way that our Westminster media just doesn't get it anymore.
I mean, you've won lots of awards for your radio programmes. What's been your proudest moment on the radio where you really feel that you've achieved something or helped somebody?
Nothing to do with politics. I really love doing emotional phone-ins where you're not necessarily going to get hundreds of people ringing in, but the calls that you do get are corkers, because it's people's own life stories. So, I mean, I'll give you 2 different sorts of examples. We were doing a phone-in on rape. Not an easy subject. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I find it easy to do those subjects, but I do try to cover subjects that normally aren't spoken about. So I've done a lot on mental health over the years. I did a phone-in on male rape not that long ago. Well, nobody ever talks about that.
Yeah,
But
I was gonna
believe me,
say,
that is a real phenomenon, judging by because my producer was saying, who's going to phone in on that? Nobody's going to phone in and say, oh, I'm a man and I've been raped by another man. Well, within 5 minutes, we had a full switchboard. It was an amazing couple of hours because we extended it because there were so many. But I will always remember Anne in Enfield. She rang in, I can't remember what the question was, and she told me about the fact that she'd been raped at a family wedding by a family member in the toilets. And she said she'd never told anyone else before. And I said, what, you've not told your husband? And she said, no. And I'm thinking, well, I hope he's not listening.
I was going to say, he knows now.
No, quite. And she described what happened in fairly graphic terms. And she got a little bit upset. I think I got a little bit upset. And it was just one of those calls where, and I think I remember saying to her, I said, Anne, I know we're not with each other, but I want to put my arm around you. And I know that I can do justice to these subjects, that there's very little that I literally can't think of anything to say. I'm not a trained psychotherapist. I'm not a trained counselor, but somehow I know that I can empathize with people, and sometimes that's all you can do.
Yeah.
And there have been many occasions where we've followed up with people where they've said something that which has worried us. I mean, we've done lots of phone-ins on depression and suicide, and again, there you really have to be careful how you handle things. But anyway, Anne then phoned in the next night, and I think we were talking about HS2 or something then, and she said to my producer, I'd like to speak to Iain again. And she said, well, you can't, because we're not talking about that tonight. She said, no, I really want to. Anyway, Laura came in my ear. She said, look, I've got Anne in Enfield on again. She wants to talk to you. And I said, well, put her on at like 3 minutes to the end of the hour.
Yeah.
So she came on and she said, Iain, I've told my husband. That was an empty stomach moment, because I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And she said, I feel like, I always get upset when I talk about this. She said, I feel I can see the light again. And she said, you do not understand what a weight off my mind this has been, talking to you and then being able to tell my husband. Yeah. And I've had quite a few incidents like that where people, I mean, it's totally illogical in that they haven't told any members of their family about something bad that's happened to them. They haven't told any of their best friends, and yet they ring a radio station and tell me about it.
Well, it's a release of a huge burden, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And in terms of job satisfaction, I enjoy doing those sorts of programs far more than the core political stuff that I do, because if anybody knows me, they just imagine that all I do is politics, because I'm a political geek. I've worked in politics all my life, one way or another. But I get so much, I mean, if you say you enjoy those sorts of things, it sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? As if you shouldn't, but I do. Yeah. It's the same with breaking news, rolling news, where something big happens in the world and you're the one that's on air. And that is, as a broadcaster, is where you sink or swim. And there have been plenty of people who think that what I do for 3 hours of an evening is really easy. What they don't understand is that anything can happen during that show. I mean,
and you've got to be able to cope.
A member of the royal family might die. Yeah. There might be a big terror. I've been on air, I think, probably 5 different big terror attacks where I've had to, and I've got no journalistic training. I've got no broadcasting training. I've had to learn it as I go along. And I remember the day that Lee Rigby was murdered in Woolwich. I mean, he was decapitated. And that happened just before I came on air. And I remember sending out a tweet saying, if anybody saw anything, give us a call. And 5 minutes before the programme was due to start, my producer, Matt, was on the phone. I was thinking, why is he on the phone? I've not got a clue what I'm going to say at 4 o'clock. Anyway, he sort of gestured to me, oh, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Anyway, this guy had seen my tweet, and he had been standing 3 yards away from it when it happened. So Matt said, just talk to James. He'll tell you exactly what happened. So James comes on after the news at 4:05, goes into some fairly gruesome graphic detail about it. So I'm then thinking, what are the Ofcom rules about this sort of thing at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you've got mothers getting their kids from school? And I just instantly made the decision, I don't really care what the Ofcom rules are. People need to hear this. Anyway, James went on and told the whole story. And after about 10 minutes, I thought, I wonder if he's still in shock. And then again, I was thinking, well, are there rules about interviewing someone who might still be in shock? So at that point, I did terminate the interview, but I said, please talk to Laura, my producer, before you hang up. And she basically counseled him for the next year. And he went through a terrible time, partly because we got the interview and everybody else wanted then to get him as well. And I mean, the lengths they went to try and get him to talk to them. And this interview was carried on Sky News every half an hour for the next 24 hours. And it remains one of the biggest interviews that I've ever done. I mean, I felt really, I wouldn't say awful, but I felt weird when that Sony award that you mentioned. I mean, it shouldn't be me that gets the award. I just gave him the opportunity to say what he needed to say. And so that was a 4-hour program on that one subject. And I remember thinking to myself, I'd only been presenting the Drive Time program for 3 months at that point. And I remember thinking, and I've been on the radio for 2.5 years. I remember thinking, I know I can do this now. And there were other occasions when, for example, when that airliner went down over Ukraine, shot down by the Russians, all we knew was that a plane had gone down. Well, that's when you really earn your money as a presenter. Well, you don't know anything else, but that you're told by the management to go into rolling news mode, which means you don't talk about anything else. You can't speculate too much.
Yes.
Because that would be inappropriate. There was a supposed terror attack in Oxford Circus a couple of Christmases ago. There's some sixth sense told me it wasn't a terror attack, but all the management was saying, no, we've got to keep going on this, go hard on it, go hard on it. And I was thinking, I don't think this is what it's supposed to be. It was when Ollie Murs said he heard a gunshot or something. And after an hour, I just decided I wasn't going to do this anymore because I just didn't think that it was. So sometimes you have to trust your instincts.
I mean, one of the themes in your book is that people have got very entrenched in their views and they can't understand other people's arguments. And that was very true in Brexit, and the actual issue split up friends and family. And you talked about the lost art of accepting losers' consent. Yeah. What does that actually mean?
Well, I think it's not just Brexit, but in many ways now, we not only think that we are 100% right and therefore everyone else is 100% wrong. We don't even think that somebody's entitled to a different opinion. And if you don't accept that somebody has a right to a different view, how can you possibly marshal your own arguments to debate with anybody properly? You have to understand, particularly if you are a politician, and I think also possibly a political journalist, you have to understand all different aspects of the argument. And look, I have some fairly trenchant views on lots of issues, but one of the things that hosting a radio show or a talk radio show for 11 years has taught me is that you can change your mind, and that I could make a perfectly legitimate theoretical argument for the bedroom tax. But when you hear, and this was actually on universal credit rather than bedroom tax, but when you hear 3 grown-up men, one after the other, breaking down in tears on national radio about the way universal credit is affecting them, you kind of know that there's something wrong, even though theoretically you can justify it. So I think what has happened over the years is that a lot of my harder edged social views have been rubbed away a bit, whether it's on benefits or immigration or crime and punishment. I think I've become, I won't say more left-wing, but possibly more socially liberal than I was 10 years ago. I mean, I've never been particularly sort of conservative with a small c on some of these issues, but when you listen to people, you've got to learn from them. And there have been occasions when I started off a phone in at the beginning of the hour, give a little monologue about my view, and then the callers during that hour have changed my view. And at the end of the hour, I said, well, I've learned a lot from this. I hope you have too. I've changed my mind.
Yes.
And it's quite a powerful thing to do. But there are so many people who are just so certain of their own rectitude that they can't even countenance that. I mean, in the Brexit row, you had Remainers thinking that Brexiteers were thick racists, and you had Brexiteers thinking that Remainers were essentially traitors to their country.
Mm.
Well, neither were true. I mean, I'm sure there were some thick racists among the Brexit side, but I suspect there would have been some thick racists who supported Remain as well. I've no idea.
Yeah.
But we're so keen to pigeonhole people, to assign views and motives to them that they don't have, that has really contributed to the decline in public discourse.
What do you think about racism and sensitivity? Do you think it's gone too far? I'm thinking of the Yorkshire cricketing captain. I mean, he said that if he'd known his words to his friends would have caused him harm, he would have stopped immediately and apologised. But he said they were having banter and both parties in the conversation were saying things. And he was really hurt that, his friend called him out as a racist and blackened his name. On an otherwise exemplary record. Do you think that racism has gone too far?
I have to pick you up there, Helen, for using the word blackened in this context. I mean, you'll be cancelled for that.
Sorry, I didn't mean it in that way.
I know, I absolutely know you didn't. You can't excuse racist comments as banter. I mean, that is a very lazy thing to do. Like, we all know, I mean, Donald Trump used to use this excuse for his, do you remember the grabbing the by the whatever?
Yeah.
See, I can't quite bring myself to say it. That was excused as locker room banter. Now, we all know that, I mean, if you get a group of lads together, you get a group of girls together, and they will probably say some inappropriate things. And this isn't just a male thing. I mean, you had plenty of examples of women behaving like this as well. And it's very difficult because you can't excuse some of the things that are alleged to have been said. You can't excuse them. And in the cold light of day, when they're written down on paper, they look absolutely terrible. But there are degrees. The problem is that every single one of us will have a different place where we draw a line.
Yes.
And I'm sure that, I mean, I can't recall sort of, I mean, it's like, I can't even think that I can say this in this event, but no, I better not, I think. But there's a takeaway meal of an Oriental variety.
Yes.
Where I come from in Essex was always known by this word, which, I mean, I remember saying it in the LBC newsroom once, and immediately 3 or 4 people, and they said, no, we know that, but you just can't say it. So I think we all have fallen guilty of this in what, to one degree or another, over time.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, Michael Vaughan, I feel very sorry for in many ways, because I don't think he actually knows what he's really being accused of. But the BBC immediately have suspended him from presenting his radio show. Now, to their credit, BT Sport haven't. But the Yorkshire Cricket Club have not covered themselves in glory in the way that they've handled it by any stretch of the imagination. And there have been lots of resignations, and in a way quite right too, because they just didn't seem to think it was sort of, oh, move along, nothing to see here. Well, any fool could have worked out that there was something to see there.
Yes. Right, I'm going to move to some of the questions from the audience, because we've got lots of questions and I don't want them to miss out. So we've got a question from Sue, and she says, apart from LBC, where would you recommend that we go to get our news? How do you check your facts before you deliver news?
Well, I wouldn't recommend that you go anywhere else to get your news. I mean, the thing is, and I mean, that's only a slight joke, in that, look, we have more news outlets now than we have ever had in this country. Now, that's a good thing in many ways. What I don't want to see is the polarization that you have in America, where if you're vaguely on the left, you go to MSNBC or CNN, and if you're on the right, you go to Fox News. I think that's actually quite unhealthy. Now, LBC encourage their presenters to be opinionated, but we have people who are left-wing opinionated and people who are right-wing opinionated, and some people actually don't. I mean, Eddie Mayer has a background in the BBC. He doesn't really offer much of an opinion. I offer an opinion to challenge my listeners to challenge me. I don't want to spend an hour talking to people who ring up and say, oh, Iain, I really agree with you. You're so wonderful. I want people to ring up and say, well, actually, no, I think you've got this wrong and this is why. And that's great public debate. But that's sort of more comment. But if you're talking about reporting news, I can report news in a completely impartial way. If I have a breaking news story, I get instantly go into BBC mode. But people know what they're going to get on LBC. They know that if they tune into LBC, invariably there will be a phone-in on something to do with today's news. Now, some people don't like phone-in, so therefore they will then gravitate to probably, I mean, there's Times Radio, which I suppose I shouldn't mention, but I mean, they're the new kids on the block. They don't take listener calls at all. And I find that odd in a way for a speech radio station, because it's just them pontificating and not being challenged at all. And then you have talk radio, which is the nearest thing to Fox News on the radio. And then you have GB News, which has just started, which I think is heading in that direction too. Now, it's open to anyone to start a CNN type, sort of with a more liberal bias, I suppose. But I think we're very lucky in this country where we have a genuine choice for people in a way that in many European countries, you don't.
Karen asks, thinking back to your time as MP in the 1980s, do you think that politicians are more liberal with the truth today? What responsibility do politicians have to lead and improve the quality of public discourse and mutual respect?
I have to fact check Karen there, because I've never been an MP. I tried to be an MP in 2005, but the electorate fought back. So I don't know where she thinks I was an MP, but I did work in Parliament in the 1980s for a couple of years. It's very tempting for people of a certain age like me to think, oh, it was so much better 30 years ago. That's when we had real politicians, people of substance. And I suspect that 30 years ago, you'd have had people saying, oh, this Thatcher cabinet is full of really weak politicians. It's not like it was under Harold Macmillan. So there's a certain amount of old gittism here going on. Look, everyone wants to have better politicians. Unfortunately, we get the politicians we deserve. And at the moment, and with all the rows over sleaze over the past couple of weeks, we are heading down a very slippery slope, because if you try to restrict politicians to doing X, Y, or Z, don't be surprised if fewer people want to be politicians. And then all you get are the political geeks who are just obsessed by being a politician, and that's all they've ever wanted in their life. And what we want is a diversity of people going into Parliament from all different backgrounds. I do want our politicians to be an elite, in the sense that they are hopefully more intelligent than the average in the country. I mean, why would we want stupid people running the country? I think even stupid people would agree with that. And look, there will always be bad apples in politics. There is, in every walk of life, everyone listening now or watching now, whatever profession you're in, you know that there are bad apples in your profession. And out of 650 MPs, I suspect that there are 10 or 20 who are wrong-uns. Well, it's probably the same among doctors or journalists or estate agents or wherever. That's not to defend people being wrong, it's just to point out that we are all humans and we are fallible, and there will be fallible politicians. And the media's job is to root them out and to try and hold them to account. It's the opposition's job to do that as well in the governing party. I'm not sure they're doing that very well at the moment, he said controversially.
Okay, Luke asks, what do you think we need to be doing in schools to improve the quality of debate in the future?
Or to actually encourage debate. I don't know nowadays how much formal training on debating there is. I think in some schools it is a big thing, but I suspect it largely depends on the motivations of some of the teachers in the school, where if you have a teacher that really loves to organise debates and maybe outside of class time does that sort of thing, I think that's the key. I remember at my school, I was really lucky where I had two teachers, history and economics teachers, who encouraged us to debate all sorts of different things with each other. I hope that goes on in schools nowadays, but I should visit more schools or do talks in more schools. I did one just before the pandemic in Ilford in East London. And I went immediately after I'd done Good Morning Britain, I went there. And there were about 130 kids, 11 to 18. It was 85% non-white school. And I find it very difficult to pitch what I do to that kind of age group, because I mean, an 11-year-old is very different to 18.
Yes.
So anyway, I did this talk for about, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. And I was thinking, I bet no one puts their hand up to ask questions. Anyway, loads did. First guy was an 11-year-old, put up his question, how much do you earn? And I thought, well, why don't you just get to the nub of it?
Yes.
And then a young girl, she was probably about 16, I think she was doing her GCSEs, and she asked some really good questions. And then she came up to me at the end and wanted to have a longer chat. And the head teacher at that school then wrote me a letter, and she said, you have no idea the effect that you will have had, particularly on that young lady. That was a life-changing moment for her. Mm. I was thinking, really? It's just me? I mean, what? And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, when I was at school, I mean, I remember the first politician I ever met was Shirley Williams. In, I think, 1977, she came and did a talk at the school. And when I thought, oh my God, she's really well known. I see her on the television. And of course, that's what happened. People in their early teenage years, they see somebody on television and they think that they're somehow different to them. And that whole experience really brought home to me that you can actually inspire people. That doesn't sound too pretentious. And I thought then I should do more. And then of course the pandemic happened, so I've done a few Zoom things, but I need to get back to doing that, I think. Because Robert Peston, to his eternal credit, he organises something called Speakers for Schools, and sort of lots of well-known people in the media and wherever, they get, so a school phones them and says, right, we want somebody for this event, and somebody relatively well-known, appropriate to it, will go. So, and I'm not sure this is publicised enough.
Right, okay. I might ask you about that later. Carol says, why are you so positive about the future when the woke culture has infiltrated so much of our establishment?
Well, I've always been a glass half full person. I couldn't live my life thinking, oh my God, we're all going to hell in a handcart. I know sometimes it appears like that. And I have to tell my producers, look, we have a news hour. We can't do it all gloom and doom stuff. There are good things happening in the world. Let's actually tell people about them. But of course, the old maxim, bad news is news, good news is advertising, still prevails in most of the media. And you can't ignore the bad news. I don't think it would ever be possible to do a good news show, but you can actually mix it up a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong in the media, and it does. I was talking to Jackie Smith today about this, about the fact that young children are being traumatized by climate change. They think the world is going to end. And I said, well, is this any different from us in the 1980s being worried about nuclear disarmament? I'm not sure it is in some ways, but of course it's bombarded at us now. We feel that, and we can't switch on the television nowadays without somebody saying, well, the world's going to end unless we buck our ideas up. Now that may be true, but I can understand why maybe some people do get quite depressed by it all.
Jenny says, for a more balanced political debate in society, by what route do you think people should get a political education? School, family, tradition, online? I worry that we all tend to adhere to our already established prejudices.
I think you're right. You are often guided by your own background. Yeah. The number of times when I was in politics where I'd knock on a door and gently inquire who they were going to vote for. Oh, we're always Conservative. We're a Labour family. And you think, do you not have minds of your own? Yeah. Just because your dad or your granddad voted Labour or Conservative, that doesn't mean to say that you have to. Have you not looked into things? And of course, the truth is that most people don't. Excuse me. For most people, politics and current affairs does not intrude in their daily lives. They might watch the news at 10, They might possibly read a newspaper if they're over a certain age. If they're under the age of 30, what's a newspaper? I mean, even media studies students now do not read newspapers.
Mm.
So I think getting your political education is important, but it can be done in a number of ways. And I think schools do have a role here. But of course, schools are really nervous because a lot of the time teachers do have strong political views and sometimes don't hide them very well. And so often schools are reticent about doing anything that could smack of party politics.
Yes.
But I remember at my school in 1979, they had a mock election and I stood as a Conservative candidate. And that really inspired my love of politics in many ways. And I know they still do mock elections in schools, but I think there is a degree of nervousness. And yes, you can learn things from your family, but there is so much opportunity to educate yourself on the internet now, in a way that there just wasn't 20 or 30 years ago.
Deborah says, "Hi Iain, do you have your own YouTube channel, as Alex Belfield is making a great success of his?"
I do have a YouTube channel, but I don't use it for original stuff. I mean, it's all things I do on LBC are put on there. I mean, I have a SoundCloud thing where I sometimes do original things, but I'm not sure how should I put this? I'm not sure I'd be using Alex Belfield as my role model if I was actually to start my own YouTube channel.
Okay, this is a message from Jane, who was the person that was at your school and sat behind your sister. And she says, "It's great to see you've been so successful." She says, "Having attended at a similar time frame to yourself, I was wondering whether there was a teacher tutor who had been a valued mentor, or whether there was another person in your life who had."
Well, I'd love to know your surname, Jane, or what it was at that time, and I'll tell my sister that you were sitting behind her. Yes, I mean, I think we all have people who were mentors to us. At my school, Jane, you'll remember David Lewis, the head of modern languages, who without him, I would not be sitting here today. He inspired my love of German. It was the only thing I was ever any good at school. I wanted to be a German teacher. I went to the University of East Anglia to study German. And if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't have met the MP that I ended up working for. So there are all these sort of sliding doors moments. And I remember at our school, Saffron Walden County High, we could only learn German if we were any good at French. Each class in the stream had to allocate 10 kids to go to study German. And I remember going home and saying to my grandmother, "Oh, they want me to do German. Why would I want to do that?" And she said, "Well, just do it. If you don't like it, you can give it up after a year or something." And that was a crucial moment for me. It really was, because at that point, I was destined to go to agricultural college. My dad was a farmer, and that was what I should have done. And had I been born 10 years earlier, I'm sure that's probably what I would have done. So he was, Bob Crossan, Nigel Wills, Steve Earnshaw, History and Economics. Again, they played massive roles in my life. And another book that I did last year, this one, I can't see it, The Prime Ministers. I've sort of really done a big acknowledgement of their role in my life. And as I say, everyone has somebody like them.
Yes. Right, we'll finish with the last question from Karen. And she says, "From your research/book, what 1 to 2 practical things can we take away and practice to get along better with people whom we disagree?"
Well, that is a good question, because when I finished writing the book, I thought, well, I think I've done a good job at diagnosing all the problems, but I've done a less good job at diagnosing what the solution should be. So what I then did was created a list of 50 different things that we can all do or all bear in mind. And I've divided them into self-improvement, debate and argument, mainstream media, social media, and mind your language, improve your behavior. So we've got 10 things in each of those, and a lot of them are actually just common sense. It's one that I mentioned earlier: just pause before you press send. I'm not going to pretend that these are sort of particularly revelatory, but for example, in the media section, I've got editors and interviewers should avoid prioritizing gotcha moments. Political interviewers should understand that it's not about them, it's about enabling the viewers and listeners to understand politics better. Broadcasters, especially the BBC, should make more effort to recruit producers from different social backgrounds or from different worldviews. programs like Question Time should retreat from the bear pit atmosphere that's encouraged at the moment, etc., etc. So if you want to know all the tips, you have to buy the book.
And I would recommend that everybody buys the book because it's a fantastic book. It makes you think about things in a different way, and also how you could improve yourself, because as you say, you know, if you shout less and listen more, we would all just get along much better, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and I think so. Sorry, I've just got the screen up here. We're looking at the questions that we haven't answered, and thank goodness you didn't ask me the one about proportional representation, because everyone would have gone to sleep. Sorry, Sue. But in short, yes, we should in local government, but not national government.
Oh dear. Now, would you like to just tell us before we finish about you've got another book coming out soon, haven't you?
Well, last year I edited The Prime Ministers, which is a collection of 55 essays about the 55 different prime ministers that we've had since Sir Robert Walpole in 1721. And it's a bit of a cheat, because I did write the chapter on Boris Johnson, but I got other people to write all the other chapters, people who knew had a real expertise in the different prime ministers. And just to show how much of an appetite there is to read about history and politics, I thought that this book, it's a £25 hardback and it's a long book, I thought it might sell 3,000 or 4,000 copies. So far it's sold more than 25,000.
Wow. And
a lot actually on Audible. I read the whole book, and if you suffer from insomnia, my voice apparently does put people to sleep, so do download that. So I thought, well, what can I do to follow that up? So next week, oh, my microphone's just fallen over. Next week, this book, The Presidents, is being published. I don't know if you can see it, but it's
you can see parts of it, yes.
Well,
yeah.
And again, this is about the 45 different American presidents. One person writes about one president, and I learned so much from that, because I love American politics, but I'm not as much of an expert on it as I am in the UK. And it was just a fascinating process. So that's coming out next week, and my next one is Kings and Queens, which will be in 2023.
Gosh, well, you certainly can't say that you're not a busy person, and thank you very much for fitting us in this evening. I know how busy you are, and it's been wonderful to meet you and have the chance to talk to you. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Right. I'm going to put a holding screen up in a minute, and that's going to tell you about our next event, which is our last webinar of the year. And we started doing webinars because of the pandemic, of course, and we're hoping to go back to live events next February. So Anita Sethi is coming to talk about I Belong Here, a journey along the backbone of Britain. And that will be the last webinar on Thursday, the 2nd of December. So please do think about joining us for that. Thank you very much for attending tonight, and I hope you all have a very pleasant rest of the evening. Thank you and goodbye.